Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Right, and we have a really fascinating topic today.
We really do. So I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine being forced to trust a doctor who has never actually been sick.
Oh, wow. That's a thought.
Right. Like, they read the textbooks, sure. They know the biological mechanics of a fever.
Yeah, they have the data.
Exactly. They can recite the symptoms of a panic attack, and they can clinically describe the physical deterioration of a chronic illness. But they have never actually felt the ache in their own bones.
They don't have the lived experience.
No, they have never experienced that sheer, terror of waiting for a diagnosis in a sterile room.
So the question is, would you trust them with your life?
I mean, I think a lot of people would hesitate.
I would secretly wonder if they were silently judging my fear, just because they don't understand it. And for centuries, that is exactly how humanity viewed the divine. Yeah, as this distant, untouched, clinical observer of our suffering.
Exactly.
It's a haunting scenario, really, but it perfectly captures the existential problem we are tackling today in this deep dive.
It really does.
Because if the ultimate authority of the universe cannot feel what we feel, I mean, how can it possibly heal us?
Right. How can there be real empathy?
That tension is exactly what the author of the ancient text of Hebrews is addressing.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We are exploring chapters 5 through 7 of Hebrews.
Such a dense section of the text.
It is, yeah. We were using the World English Bible text alongside the historical and theological commentaries of Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry. But, we are not here to give you a dry theological lecture.
Nobody wants that.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
We are here to act as your guides, helping you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the real-world application from this ancient work.
Because there is so much application here for today.
Oh, absolutely. So, if we are going to understand how this text radically redefines divine leadership, we have to start by looking at who the author was writing to. I mean, this wasn't written in a vacuum, right?
Not at all, no. The original audience was a community of Jewish Christians living in the first century, and they were, frankly, in a state of profound crisis.
Like full-blown existential crisis.
Exactly. They were facing persecution. But I think we need to understand what persecution actually meant for them in that specific moment.
Right, because we hear that word and we just think of physical violence.
Yeah, and physical danger was definitely a threat, but it was also total social and economic ostracization.
Which is devastating.
It is. If you were a Jewish person who embraced this new Christian sect, you were often cut off from the synagogue.
And the synagogue wasn't just a place where you went for an hour on Saturday.
Right. No, it was the absolute center of your community. It was your family network, your business contacts. To be cut off meant losing your livelihood. You couldn't buy or sell with people you'd known your whole life.
Wow, so it's complete isolation.
Complete isolation.
Yeah.
And furthermore, Judaism was an established, legally recognized, and protected religion in the Roman Empire.
Oh, I see. So they had legal cover.
They did. But Christianity was a new, suspicious, and often illegal fringe movement. So by converting, they lost their legal protection under Roman law.
So they were exposed on all sides.
Exactly. They were exhausted. They were terrified.
And when human beings are exhausted and terrified, we regress. I mean, that's just human nature. We look for safety.
We look for the familiar, yeah.
Precisely. And for this audience, safety was the Levitical system of Judaism. It was ancient, it was established, and most importantly, it was visible.
Visibility is huge here.
Right. You could walk to Jerusalem and see the temple. You could smell the incense burning. You could hear the chants of the priests. You could physically reach out and touch the altar.
It engages all the senses.
Exactly. When your world is falling apart, you want something tangible to hold on to. But the new Christian system they had embraced was invisible.
Yeah, it was all about a spiritual priesthood and a heavenly temple.
Which feels precarious when the Roman authorities are knocking on your door. So the temptation for them was immense. Like, let's go back to the physical priests and the bleeding animals. It's safer there.
It's the path of least resistance.
I can completely understand that. It's that universal human temptation to retreat to a bad but familiar situation when the path forward gets dark.
We see that all the time today.
Oh, all the time. Like, you stay in the toxic job because you know exactly how the toxicity works. Or you stay in a broken relationship because the loneliness of the unknown is somehow scarier than the pain you already know.
That is such a perfect parallel.
Yeah. And the author of Hebrews recognizes this deeply human instinct. His entire argument in these chapters is structured to prove that going backward would be a catastrophic mistake, because what they have in this new system is infinitely superior.
Right. He has to prove that the invisible is better than the visible.
Exactly. And he starts this argument by talking about the concept of a high priest.
Which was the ultimate mediator for them.
Yes. So to understand the disruption, we have to understand the baseline. What was a high priest supposed to be in the ancient world?
Well, Hebrews chapter 5 opens by stating that every high priest is taken from among men and appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins.
Okay, so taken from among men. That's the key phrase.
It is the absolute core requirement of the ancient Jewish high priest, according to Barnes's commentary, is that he couldn't be an angel.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he couldn't be a celestial, unfeeling being. He absolutely had to be human.
But why? I mean, why was human frailty considered a feature and not a bug in this system?
It comes down to psychology. The text explicitly says he is chosen from among men so that he can deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray.
Deal gently. I like that phrasing.
It's a great translation. The Greek word used there is fascinating. It means to moderate one's passions, to not be overly severe or angry.
Oh, so he has to keep his own judgment in check.
Exactly. And how does the priest achieve this moderation? Because he himself is, as the text says, surrounded with weakness. When the ancient high priest walked into the temple on the Day of Atonement, the very first sacrifice he had to make was for his own sins.
Not for the people's sins?
Nope, his own. He couldn't point a judgmental finger at the people because his hands were quite literally covered in the blood of his own necessary sacrifice. He shared their exact moral failure.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that makes perfect sense for the old system. The shared weakness breeds empathy. You don't judge the person drowning when you are also treading water right next to them.
Exactly. You're both in the same boat.
But here is my pushback, and I am certain this is exactly what the original Jewish audience was thinking as they read this letter.
I'm sure they were.
If the new high priest of this Christian system is Jesus, the Son of God, who the text claims is without sin, how can he possibly relate to human weakness?
Right. That's the glaring contradiction.
Yeah. If he doesn't have personal moral failure, doesn't that make him the doctor who only read the textbook?
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't a sinless priest inherently lack the empathy required to deal gently with us?
It is the ultimate question, and the author of Hebrews answers it with one of the most stunning, visceral descriptions of the divine in all of ancient literature.
Okay, what does he say?
The author points out that you do not need to share in the sin of humanity to share in the suffering of humanity.
Ooh, that's a crucial distinction.
It's everything. Listen to how the text describes Christ in the days of his flesh. It says he offered up prayers and petitions with strong crying and tears to him who was able to save him from death and was heard for his godly fear.
Strong crying and tears.
No.
Wow, that is completely antithetical to the stoic, detached image of a deity that was popular back then.
Completely. I mean, the Greco-Roman gods were apathetic. They didn't feel human pain.
Right, they were above it all.
But Albert Barnes, in his commentary, links this passage directly to the historical accounts of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his execution.
Where he was sweating drops of blood.
Exactly. He experienced the absolute crushing dread of mortality. He wasn't calmly accepting his fate. He was in agony. He was begging for another way.
He was terrified.
He was. And the text goes on to say something incredibly profound. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered.
Wait. Learned obedience.
Yeah.
If he is divine, shouldn't he automatically know everything? I mean, how does God learn?
Well, it's not about acquiring intellectual data. He didn't learn obedience because he was previously rebellious. He learned it experimentally.
Experimentally.
Yeah.
Like a test.
Think of it like a material scientist testing the tensile strength of a new metal. You can know the mathematical properties of the metal on paper, right?
Sure.
But you don't truly know its strength until you put it in the forge and strike it with a hammer. Christ tested the reality of human obedience in the crucible of intense physical and psychological suffering.
So he lived it.
He lived it. He proved that obedience isn't just easy compliance when the sun is shining. It is a gritty, agonizing choice made in the dark through tears and terror.
Wow. This translates so powerfully to the listener right now, especially regarding how we view our own emotional pain.
It really does.
We live in a society, and let's be honest, we participate in modern religious and corporate cultures that view suffering fear, and especially tears as signs of absolute failure.
Oh, without a doubt.
If you're crying at your desk, you're weak. If you're terrified of a medical diagnosis, people tell you that you lack faith or you just need positive thinking. We are constantly told to manifest success and just bury the dread.
It's toxic positivity, and it is entirely absent from this ancient text.
It really is.
Barnes makes a brilliant, simple observation in his notes here. He says, "It is not unmanly to weep."
I love that.
Right. God engineered the human body to find biological and psychological relief in tears. The fact that the divine incarnate utilized that mechanism, that the Son of God wept, felt dread, and cried out for help, completely dismantles the lie that true strength is unfeeling.
So when you, the listener, face intense sorrow, when you feel the creeping dread of mortality or failure or loneliness, what do you do with that? Do you shame yourself for feeling weak?
Most of us do.
We do. But the wisdom of Hebrews invites you to recognize that this is a shared human experience. The divine actually participated in it. And here's the practical shift. Instead of letting your infirmities and your anxieties isolate you in shame, use them.
Use them to connect.
Yes. Use them to cultivate deep, radical empathy for others who are, as the text says, out of the way. When someone else is failing, you don't judge them because you remember the exact taste of your own tears. You can be the empathetic guide for someone else.
That is the exact mechanism of the priesthood the author is trying to establish. It's beautiful. But right as he builds this soaring theology of a suffering, empathetic high priest, he hits a brick wall.
Oh, he does. It's one of the most abrupt transitions in the entire text.
Right.
He hit Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11, and the author essentially stops mid-sentence and says, I have a lot more to say about this, and it's hard to explain because you have become dull of hearing.
He totally reads the room of his audience.
He does. He realizes they're completely zoning out.
Yeah, and dull of hearing is actually a pretty polite translation.
Really, what's the literal meaning?
The Greek implies sluggishness, like a deep mental laziness. He points out that considering how much time has passed since they first believed, they ought to be teachers by now.
But they're not.
No, they have regressed. They need someone to teach them the basic rudiments of the first principles all over again. He uses this universal metaphor. They need milk, not solid food.
I want to use a modern analogy for this because I think milk versus solid food can sound a bit cliche to modern ears. We've heard it a lot.
Sure, yeah.
It's like someone who has been going to the gym for 10 years, but they only ever lift the 2-pound pink dumbbells.
Oh, that's a great image.
Right, like you have the membership card, you know the front desk staff by name, you know exactly where all the equipment is, but your actual muscle mass is entirely atrophied because you refuse to put any real weight on the bar.
You're just going through the motion.
Exactly. You are doing the absolute bare minimum to say you went to the gym, but you are terrified of the strain required to actually grow.
That is a perfect parallel. Matthew Henry's commentary brings out the sheer frustration of the author here. He notes that dull hearers make the preaching a difficult thing.
I bet.
There is a fundamental difference between being a beginner and being stagnant. When you first start at the gym, the 2-pound weights are appropriate.
Of course.
Being a babe in knowledge isn't an insult when you are genuinely new. We all start on milk. But remaining an infant intentionally, refusing to chew on complex ideas after years of exposure, that is a tragic refusal to mature.
And here is where it gets really interesting and frankly a bit convicting for us today.
Oh, definitely.
The author lists what he considers to be milk. He lists these basic baby food doctrines at the start of chapter 6, he says. Repentance from dead works, faith toward God, the teaching of baptisms, laying on of hands, resurrection of the dead, and eternal judgment.
Look closely at that list.
I am looking at it, and for a lot of modern listeners, that list sounds like the syllabus for an advanced theology seminar.
It really does.
But the author of Hebrews is looking at his audience and saying, no, that's kindergarten. That is the foundational concrete. Why are we still staring at the concrete? We need to build the house. We need to move on to perfection, to maturity.
This translates directly into our modern era of information overload. We live in a time where we have access to more theological, philosophical, and psychological data in our pockets than any generation in human history.
It's literally boundless.
Yet true, deep understanding is remarkably rare. We are culturally addicted to milk.
We really are.
When it comes to learning, we want the 15-second TikTok revelation. We want the quick fix 5-step morning routine. We want the comfortable, easily digestible quotes that don't require us to wrestle with nuance or mystery.
We mistake consuming content for actual growth. We think because we listened to a 3-hour deep dive, even this one, that we have somehow achieved maturity.
Right, just because you heard it doesn't mean you grew.
Exactly. But the text gives us the actual mechanism for transitioning from milk to solid food. It says solid food is for those who, by reason of use, have their senses exercised to discern good and evil.
By reason of use, that's the key.
You cannot simply consume information to become mature. You must apply it in the friction of the real world.
You have to exercise your moral and intellectual muscles.
Yes. This means taking a principle you learned, applying it to a complex conflict at your office, probably making a massive mistake, analyzing that failure, course-correcting, and trying again.
Through that exhausting process, you develop what Albert Barnes calls a delicate taste for truth, a spiritual and moral intuition.
So, a practical reality check for you, the listener. Take an inventory of your mental diet right now, the podcasts you listen to, the books you buy, the articles you skim. Are you just collecting data points?
Are you just drinking gallons of intellectual milk every day?
And secretly wondering why you don't feel any stronger when a real crisis hits? Knowledge that isn't applied rots into pride. You have to put weight on the bar.
And we have to press this point because the author of Hebrews makes it terrifyingly clear that this refusal to grow isn't just a matter of being a bit lazy.
It's not just a missed opportunity.
No, it isn't just about missing your potential. It is incredibly dangerous. This spiritual stagnation brings us right to the edge of a cliff.
And coasting on the basics inevitably leads to slipping backward.
Which transitions the text into what is undeniably one of the most severe, hotly debated, and terrifying warnings in all of ancient literature.
Okay, let's look at this warning, because it is intense.
Extremely intense.
The text says that concerning those who were once enlightened, tasted the heavenly gift, were made partakers of the Holy Spirit, tasted the good word of God and the powers of the age to come, and then fell away. It is impossible to renew them again to repentance, seeing they crucified the Son of God for themselves again and put him to open shame.
Yeah.
I have to push back here on behalf of every anxious listener right now. This feels like walking a tightrope across the Grand Canyon where one single accidental slip means permanent doom.
It does sound like that.
Impossible to renew them. I mean, why would the author use such severe absolutist language? It sounds like if you have a season of doubt, you're permanently cut off forever.
Your reaction is exactly why this passage has caused centuries of theological anxiety. We really need to navigate this with careful discernment, explain the mechanics of the debate without necessarily taking a side, so listeners understand what is at stake here.
That makes sense.
Both Barnes and Henry highlight the massive historical divide this text sparked, primarily between the Calvinist and Arminian theological traditions.
All right, let's break those down. What are the actual mechanics of those two views?
On one side, you have the Calvinist tradition, which emphasizes the sovereignty of God and the preservation of the saints.
Okay.
This view argues that if you are truly saved, God's grace preserves you. You literally cannot lose your salvation. Therefore, when they read Hebrews 6, they argue that the people described here who tasted the heavenly gift and fell away were never truly genuine believers in the first place.
So they're basically faking it.
Essentially, yes. They were hypocrites. They experienced the benefits of the Christian community. They sampled the truth like someone tasting a sample at a grocery store, but they never actually swallowed it and digested it.
Oh, I see.
So when persecution hit, they abandoned a faith they never genuinely possessed.
Okay, so in that view, it's a warning against fake, superficial attachment. What is the other side of the debate?
The Arminian tradition emphasizes human free will and conditional security. They argue that God does not hold us hostage against our will. They point to the incredibly strong language of the text words like enlightened and partakers of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, those sound pretty genuine.
Barnes points out that in any other context, these words absolutely describe a true born-again believer. Therefore, the Arminian view argues that a genuine believer can, through willful, sustained rebellion, entirely abandon their faith and forfeit their salvation.
And if they do that, the text says it's impossible to get it back, which is terrifying in either theological framework.
It really is.
But Barnes also points out a nuance in the grammar here, right?
Yes, and this is crucial for the anxious listener who might be panicking right now. The text says if they fall away, it is a conditional statement.
If.
Many scholars argue the author is using a hypothetical extreme to jolt a complacent audience awake.
Like a shock tactic.
Think of it like a parent telling a child, if you run into that busy highway, you will die.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
The parent isn't predicting the child will do it, nor are they saying the child has already done it just by stepping off the curb. They are describing the true ultimate consequence of a hypothetical action to enforce the absolute necessity of staying in the yard.
Matthew Henry echoes this, noting that the sin described here isn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It isn't struggling with addiction or having a panic attack or wrestling with deep intellectual doubt.
Whoa, not all.
It is total willful apostasy. It is a complete turning of the back on the truth, to the point where they are publicly mocking and putting to open shame the very concept of Christ. It's not about stumbling in weakness, it's about deliberate treason.
Exactly. And this raises the most important question. What is the core truth beneath the historical debate?
What's the bottom line?
The core truth is a matter of logical mechanics. If you experience the ultimate reality, if you are given the absolute highest truth and the ultimate final cure for the human condition, and you deliberately, decisively throw it away in contempt, what else is there?
There's nothing left.
There is no plan B for salvation. There is no secondary path. If a terminal patient violently rejects the only known medicine that can cure their disease, it becomes impossible for them to be cured.
Not because the doctor is cruel.
Right, but because the mechanism of healing has been refused.
To drive this home, the author uses a really fascinating agricultural metaphor here. He talks about land that drinks the rain that comes often upon it. If the land produces a useful crop for the farmer, it receives a blessing from God.
Which is what you want.
But if that exact same rain falls on the land and it bears thorns and thistles, it is rejected, near to being cursed, and its ultimate end is to be burned.
It's a stark comparative insight into human nature. The exact same resource, the rain produces entirely different results depending on the condition of the soil.
The rain doesn't discriminate.
Exactly, the rain just falls.
Let's translate this into modern self-reflection. We all have rain falling on our lives. You have resources, you have time, you have education, access to information, the love of family, the support of friends. You have the truth you are hearing right now.
That's all rain.
The question the text forces upon us is, what is your soil doing with that rain?
Are you absorbing those resources and producing a yield? Are you creating value, kindness, empathy, and growth for those around you? Or are you absorbing all that good rain, taking all those resources, and producing toxic thorns? Are you producing bitterness, regression, selfishness, and harm to your community?
This is such a vital question for you, the listener, to really mull over. Look at the rain in your life right now. Are you using your resources to cultivate a garden? Or are you letting the water pool into stagnant puddles of apathy?
Or worse, actively growing thistles.
Yes. Growing thistles that prick everyone who gets close to you. The terrifying reality of the agricultural metaphor is that if we don't actively work the soil to grow crops, the thorns will take over by default. Entropy is the natural state of an untended life.
It is a devastating warning. And just as the original audience is probably hyperventilating, just as the modern listener might be feeling the heavy weight of this, the author proves his brilliance as a pastor and a psychological guide.
He doesn't just leave them hanging over the cliff.
He doesn't leave them hovering over the cliff at all. He immediately pivots from the threat of destruction to the ultimate safety line. In Hebrews 6:9, he shifts his tone completely and says, "But, beloved, we are persuaded of better things for you, and things that accompany salvation, even though we speak like this."
The relief in that sentence is palpable.
It's like a deep breath.
He's basically saying, I just painted the worst-case scenario to wake you up, but I don't actually believe that's who you are. He then moves to anchor their anxiety by bringing up Abraham.
The father of their faith.
Right. He reminds the audience that when God made a promise to Abraham to bless him and multiply him, God swore by himself because there was no one greater to swear by.
Right. The text calls these the two immutable things, God's promise and God's oath, in which it is impossible for God to lie.
Two immutable things.
And because of these two unchanging, unmovable things, we who have fled for refuge have strong encouragement.
But wait, let's look at the mechanics of this for a second. Why does God need to take an oath?
Good question.
If God is the ultimate truth, and it is impossible for him to lie, isn't a promise enough? Isn't an oath totally redundant?
It is entirely redundant from God's perspective. But Barnes notes a beautiful psychological truth here. An oath doesn't make God any more truthful, but it accommodates human weakness.
It's for us.
Exactly. In ancient human society, just as in modern courts, an oath is the ultimate guarantee. It ends a dispute. God condescends to our level of anxiety and doubt.
He meets us where we are.
He looks at our terrified, finite minds and essentially says, I know my word is enough, but I know you are terrified of the dark. I know the world is chaotic, so I will speak your language. I will give you the highest possible human concept of security, an oath to anchor your mind.
And there's the key word, anchor. The text introduces one of the most famous metaphors in the ancient world. He says this hope is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters into that which is within the veil.
It's a brilliant metaphor.
Think about navigating a ship through a fierce, blinding modern storm. This is the reality of the 21st century for so many of you listening. You are navigating shifting cultural norms that change every 5 minutes.
It feels impossible to keep up.
You are dealing with unreliable institutions, economic anxiety, personal health crises, and relationship breakdowns. It is a blinding, deafening storm. Now, what does a ship's anchor actually do? An anchor does not stop the storm.
No, it doesn't.
The wind still howls, the waves still crash over the deck, the ship still pitches violently. But the anchor connects the ship to the solid, unmoving seabed beneath the chaos. It prevents the ship from being blown into the rocks and shattered.
And we have to pay attention to the specific mechanics of where this anchor goes.
Right, because it's not a normal anchor.
Not at all. The author says it enters within the veil. In the ancient Jewish temple, the veil was the massive, thick curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies.
Where the presence of God dwelt.
Yes, the innermost sanctuary. No one could go in there except the high priest, once a year. The author is saying that our anchor doesn't drop down into the muddy, shifting ocean floor of this world. It drops up.
It drops up. I love that.
It is thrown upward, piercing through the veil, directly into the eternal throne room of God.
So, if we translate this into a practical application for the listener,
Yeah.
when you feel completely adrift, when the storm of life is spinning you around, you need to identify exactly what you are anchored to.
You have to check your lines.
If your ultimate sense of safety is anchored to your bank account, your career trajectory, your physical health, or even the fluctuating emotions and loyalties of other people, you are in profound danger.
Because all those things change.
They're not the seabed. They are just other pieces of driftwood in the storm. They can break, they change, they die. If your anchor is tied to the temporary, you will be swept away. You have to consciously shift your ultimate reliance to the immutable, unchanging character of the divine. That is the only anchor that will hold when the bottom drops out of your life.
Which brings us perfectly to the critical question. How did our anchor get up there? Who carried it behind the veil?
Right.
The text says, Jesus entered as our forerunner, becoming a high priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek.
Bounty of the day.
And with that single mysterious name, we cross the threshold into Hebrews chapter 7. The author finally gets to dive into the deep theological waters he paused earlier when he said they were dull of hearing.
He's like, all right, playtime is over.
Exactly. He's saying, okay, the warning is over, the comfort is established, now it's time for solid food. Let's talk about Melchizedek.
And as a reader, I'm screaming, yes, please. Who is this guy? Why does this mysterious figure get an entire, highly technical chapter dedicated to him?
To understand the massive paradigm shift the author is proposing, we have to look back at the historical record in Genesis chapter 14.
Okay, let's go back.
Melchizedek is a figure who appears literally out of nowhere. Abraham, the great patriarch of the Jewish faith, is returning from a massive, exhausting battle where he rescued his nephew Lot from a coalition of kings.
A big military victory.
Huge. And suddenly, Melchizedek comes out to meet him. His name is highly symbolic. Melchi means king. Zedek means righteousness. So he's the king of righteousness.
Okay.
He's also the king of Salem, and Salem means peace. So he is the king of peace. He brings out bread and wine to refresh Abraham. He acts as a priest of God Most High. He pronounces a blessing on Abraham, and in response, Abraham gives him a tithe, a tenth of all the spoils of the battle.
Wow.
And then, as quickly as he appeared, Melchizedek vanishes from the historical narrative.
Okay, that's a cool historical cameo. But the author of Hebrews points out a detail that would have been an absolute shocker for the original Jewish audience.
A total scandal.
He notes that Melchizedek is without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually.
Yeah, that's a wild statement.
Now, wait a minute. I have to push back hard here. If I am a first-century Jew reading this, my entire religious reality, my access to God, is built on genealogy.
Bloodlines were everything.
You couldn't just claim to be a priest. You had to prove with meticulous records that you were descended from the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron. Your birth date and your death date were legally recorded to track your term of service. Is the text seriously trying to tell me that this guy was an immortal, eternal being just wandering around the Middle Eastern desert?
That's how it sounds, right?
Because that sounds like a massive loophole. How did the original audience not reject this outright?
It is one of the most misunderstood passages, and your pushback is exactly what a skeptical reader would feel. We have to apply wisdom with discernment here, relying heavily on the historical context provided by our commentators.
What do Barnes and Henry say?
Both Barnes and Henry clarify that the author of Hebrews is not saying Melchizedek was a literal immortal being.
Whoa.
The author is utilizing a specific, recognized rabbinic style of argument, arguing from the silence of the text.
Arguing from the silence. How does that work?
In Jewish law, if it isn't in the official genealogical record, it legally doesn't exist for the purposes of the priesthood. Moses, who wrote Genesis, meticulously recorded the genealogies, birth years, and death years of almost every major figure.
Pages and pages of begats.
Exactly. But when he wrote about Melchizedek, he intentionally left all of that out. The record is completely silent regarding his parents, his birth, and his death.
So it's a legal technicality.
It is.
Yeah.
Therefore, because the sacred text presents him without a recorded beginning or end, he serves as the perfect literary and theological type, a prophetic symbol for Christ.
That is fascinating.
He represents a priesthood that is entirely alien to the Levitical system. It does not depend on human ancestry, tribal affiliation, or biological succession. The argument is that Melchizedek's priesthood stands alone, unbracketed by the legal requirements of birth and death, making him the perfect shadow of the eternal Son of God.
That makes so much sense. It's a brilliant legal argument. He's basically saying, look at your own Torah. Moses deliberately left out his family tree to show us that a different, superior kind of priesthood has always existed.
Exactly. He uses their own text against their objections.
And the text presses the advantage here. It points out that Abraham, the great patriarch, the father of the whole nation, the one who held the promises of God, paid tithes to Melchizedek and received a blessing from him. And as the author states, as an undeniable axiom of ancient culture, without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater.
Right. Abraham submitting to Melchizedek proves Melchizedek is greater.
This was a radical, earth-shattering disruption of the status quo for the original audience. The author is using their own history to prove that the old Levitical law, which came from Abraham's great-grandson Levi, is legally and spiritually inferior to this older Melchizedekian priesthood.
It dismantles their whole argument for going back to the old system.
It really does. He argues that if the old law could actually make human beings perfect, if you could actually clear the conscience and fix the human heart, why would God say in Psalm 110, hundreds of years later, that a new priest would come from a different order?
Why introduce a new priest if the old ones were working?
Exactly. The logic is airtight. A change in the priesthood demands a change in the entire legal system.
And there is a fascinating comparative insight here regarding ancient power structures.
Let's hear it.
In most ancient pagan cultures, the roles of king and priest were combined in one absolute ruler. The emperor was also the chief priest.
It was a lot of concentrated power.
Too much power. But in Judaism, those roles were strictly legally separated to prevent the abuse of absolute power. The kings could only come from the tribe of Judah. The priests could only come from the tribe of Levi. You could not be both.
It's like an ancient separation of powers.
Exactly like that. But here, in the order as Melchizedek, those two separated streams of authority merge. The King of Righteousness and the Priest of the Most High are reunited perfectly in one person, Jesus.
Wow.
Because he is from the tribe of Judah, the royal line, but holds an eternal priesthood, the Melchizedek line. He possesses complete ultimate authority combined with total perfect mediation. He has the power of a king to protect you and the empathy of a priest to heal you.
This requires a major modern translation for our own lives, because the core principle here isn't just about ancient Jewish law. The text argues that a massive disruption of the old system was entirely necessary because, as verse 18 says, the old commandment was weak and useless for actually perfecting human beings.
Weak and useless. That's quite an indictment.
Think about how often we cling to old established systems in our own lives simply because we are used to them. We hold on to old toxic ways of working. We hold on to old coping mechanisms like drinking or scrolling for hours or isolating when we are stressed.
We all have those default settings.
We hold on to destructive patterns of handling conflict in our marriages. We keep running these systems because they are familiar, even when we know deep down they are weak and useless.
Right.
They don't bring perfection. They don't bring peace.
We are terrified of the void. We would rather live with a familiar, broken system than step into the unknown of a new paradigm.
Because the unknown is scary.
It is. The challenge of Melchizedek is the challenge to embrace disruption. It is the courage to look at the systems you trust to save you, your money, your status, your defense mechanisms, and admit they are fundamentally incapable of making you whole. We need the courage to let go of the inferior systems and embrace what the author calls the better hope through which we draw near to God.
That is a massive, terrifying challenge. Letting go of what we know, even if it's broken, feels like free-falling. But the text gives us the ultimate reassurance of why we must let go. And this brings us to the climax of the argument in these chapters, the concept of being saved to the uttermost.
My favorite phrase in the whole section.
It's so good. Because this new priesthood is not based on a fragile biological lineage, but on the power of an endless life and secured by a divine oath, the results it produces are permanent. It completely eclipses the exhausting, temporary nature of our past efforts.
Let's look at the contrast the author draws in the final verses of chapter 7. He points out the fatal flaw of the old Levitical priests. They were many in number.
Because they kept dying?
Exactly. Death constantly interrupted their work. You might have a truly empathetic, wonderful high priest for a decade, but then he dies and you get his son, who might be corrupt or indifferent. The mediation was constantly fractured by mortality.
It's a revolving door.
Furthermore, because their work was imperfect, they had to offer sacrifices daily.
Every single day.
Imagine the logistics of this. The ancient temple was, in many ways, an absolute slaughterhouse. They had to kill animals every single day, morning and evening, first to cover their own flaws and then to cover the flaws of the people.
That sounds incredibly dark and heavy.
It was an endless, bloody, repetitive cycle that never actually cured the disease of the human heart. It only managed the symptoms for 24 hours. The ledger was never fully cleared.
Let's pause and really feel the psychological exhaustion of that old system. Imagine having to make a daily payment, a daily sacrifice, just to clear your conscience, knowing full well you're going to mess up and have to do the exact same thing again tomorrow.
It's a Sisyphean task.
It is a hamster wheel of guilt and appeasement. You can never truly rest because the debt is never permanently paid. But contrast that with the new priest. The text says Jesus lives forever. Therefore, he has an unchangeable priesthood.
Death does not interrupt his mediation.
And here is the pivot that changes the world. He offered himself once for all. He doesn't need to do it daily. The sacrifice was so perfect, so infinite in its value, that it never needs to be repeated.
Never again.
And because of that, verse 25 says, he is also able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, seeing he ever lives to make intercession for them.
To the uttermost. The Greek word there means completely, perfectly, entirely for all time. There is nothing left undone.
Which is incredible news.
It is. And yet, the modern tragedy and the primary obstacle to our spiritual growth is that we still try to run our lives on the old Levitical system.
Yes, we do this every single day.
We constantly try to expiate our own guilt. We know we are flawed. We feel the weight of our inadequacy.
Right.
And so we invent our own daily sacrifices to appease the universe.
We sacrifice our health to hustle culture, overworking ourselves to the point of burnout, subconsciously believing that if we just achieve enough, we will finally prove we are valuable.
That's a modern altar right there.
We become chronic people pleasers, sacrificing our own boundaries and authenticity to appease others so they won't reject us. We engage in brutal self-punishment, replaying our mistakes in our heads every night at 2 a.m. as a way of paying penance for our failures.
It is the exact same psychological trap as the ancient Jewish audience, just without the stone altar and the incense.
We are trying to buy our own worth on an installment plan that we can never, ever pay off.
And the obstacle here is that accepting grace feels completely countercultural. It actually feels offensive to our ego.
It really does.
Yeah.
We are conditioned by society, by capitalism, by social media metrics, to believe that we must constantly, daily earn our worth.
Simply receive a completed salvation. To accept that the ultimate king and priest has already settled the account to the uttermost feels too easy.
It feels like a trap.
It does. It requires us to lay down our ego and admit we cannot save ourselves. It requires the ultimate surrender of control. The old system, for all its bloody exhaustion, gave people a sense of control. If I do X, God will do Y.
Right. It was transactional.
The new system says Christ has done everything. Rest in it. And rest is terrifying for someone addicted to earning their worth.
Which brings us to our final reflection for you, the listener. Where in your life are you currently acting like an ancient, exhausted priest? Where are you making daily grinding sacrifices of your mental health, your peace, or your authenticity just to prove your worth or cover up your perceived flaws?
Such an important question.
The wisdom of this ancient text is an invitation to step off the treadmill of self-justification. It invites you to draw near to a high priest who actually understands your weakness because he wept in the garden too.
Yeah.
Let go of the daily grind of trying to save yourself. You can't do it. The old law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope does.
And as we close our exploration today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thread to pull on your own. We have talked extensively about how perfection couldn't come by the old law and how this new high priest brings a better hope founded on the power of an endless life.
Yeah.
If that is true, if you are living under the guarantee of a life that does not end, secured by an oath from the divine that cannot be broken, how does that alter the mechanics of your daily life? How does it change the way you interact with the very finite, very temporary problems you're going to face tomorrow morning?
That changes everything.
If your anchor is truly hooked into the eternal bedrock behind the veil, how much power do the passing storms of this week actually have over you?
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.